Well, it's November now, and that means we are a few weeks into the NHL season for 2023-2024. So what better time to review one of the games that is always in the discussion of best sports titles on the Sega Genesis, and that is NHL 94. What is it about NHL 94 that makes it so beloved to the point of having the game re-released a few years ago to coincide with the 2020 season on modern consoles, but with the twist of having all the modern teams and players? And just as an aside, if you haven't given NHL 94 Rewind a shot yet and you're a fan of hockey, I'm just not sure what you're doing with your life. I mean, that would be like if Tecmo was able to pull off a modern Tecmo Bowl release, but this time around they were actually able to include all of the proper licensed teams and players. I mean, who isn't going to play that? Anyway, we'll get into the secret sauce of what makes NHL 94 a timeless game in a few minutes, but first, what is Zilog and Moto and why are you here? Well, all returning visitors and subscribers know what the deal is, but if this is your first time here, welcome, and I would guess that you're here because you clicked on a button on YouTube, or else something very strange happened. Regardless of that, Zilog and Moto is the YouTube channel that I started almost 5 years ago now, with the goal of collecting and reviewing every English language game for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X, of which I was finally able to add 2 more games to that collection last week, leaving me with only 13 32X games left to pick up. So that's nice. Every week or so, I pick up one of these games to review it, looking at not just the game, but also its original packaging, to really try to get a feel for what it was like to play it for the first time 30 or so years ago. For NHL 94 specifically, at the recording of this video, it was right at 30 years ago that most people played it for the first time, with it making its debut on the Genesis in both the United States and Europe in mid-September of 1993, hitting the market just before the 93-94 season started. Along with the Genesis version, the game would also appear on the Sega CD, which I'll be covering in a later video. Seriously, like 2 years from now. Don't wait around on that. And then also the Super Nintendo. And interestingly, the NHL 94 marked the series debut on the PC as well, although it was just called NHL Hockey there. The reason why I say interestingly is because if you're not aware, all of Electronic Arts' other sports franchises, Lakers vs. Celtics, PGA Tour Golf, and John Madden Football, and then also to a lesser extent Tony La Russa Baseball, all appeared on PC before being ported to home consoles. Personally, I don't have the same attachment to NHL 94 as I do a certain later release in the series that I put far too many hours into, because growing up I owned NHL 95 and not 94. But that's not to say that I never played NHL 94. I'm sure I rented it or something somewhere along the line. Having said that though, I really only remembered one main thing that made the game so notable, and that was the fact that for the first time Electronic Arts was able to obtain both NHL and NHLPA licensing in the game, meaning that finally players didn't have to choose between playing an EA hockey game that featured real teams and logos, but no name players, or play ones that had all of the players that you knew and loved, but only generically named teams with colors that kind of match the real thing. Nowadays, this might seem like a very strange problem to have, but back in 1993, the struggle was real in more ways than one. But surely there were other less obvious changes made to the game to separate it out from the previous year's edition, right? Well, we'll take a look at all that, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of NHL 94. This copy's in pretty decent shape, although if you look closely at the top and bottom of the box, it does look slightly dingy, so perhaps it was owned by a smoker once upon a time. Thankfully, it does not smell like it was owned by a smoker, or else I probably would have replaced it a long time ago. One interesting note here, the clamshell looks like an ordinary later release Electronic Arts clamshell, right? Well, apparently not, as it appears this particular one at one point had a hang tab, and I can't ever remember seeing another EA release that had a hang tab. That's about an 11 on the useless trivia scale, but just for fun, look through your EA collection and see if you can find one that has a hang tab. I really wonder if there were any other releases besides NHL 94. Like other EA Sports releases in 1993, NHL 94 was released in both a limited edition, as you can see by the gold seal on the front cover, and then non-limited edition without the seal, but for all intents and purposes, there's no real difference between the two, other than this being the first run of the game. If I did decide I wanted to pick up a cleaner copy of the game, similar complete limited edition copies of the game go for between $20 to $25. But as we'll see in a minute, this is a true complete copy of the game, so I don't see myself replacing it. As far as the front cover art goes, I like it, although it definitely is a bit simple. At this point, EA had decided on specific cover formatting for all of their EA Sports titles, and from 1993 on, all of them would have their art placed on solid white backgrounds, meaning that these games tend to stand out on your shelves, especially amongst the red spine titles that Sega used for everyone else from mid-1993 on. The action shot shows a LA Kings player driving on the Boston Bruins, and it looks good, but confusingly, for some reason, it appears the name and number of the Kings player, Thomas Sandstrom, has been edited out, which I don't really understand considering how they didn't do the same for the Bruins players. And honestly, they shouldn't have needed to, due to the NHL and NHLPA licensing shown buffering the sides of the title logo down at the bottom. Just for completeness sake, the European version is pretty similar, which mainly just has hockey added to the title logo, I guess for Europeans that perhaps didn't know what the NHL was. But that's just silly, everyone knows the NHL. Flipping over the back, and Electronic Arts really had this down to a science at this point. There's an original layout of screenshots, and I like how they had some that were zoomed in to show detail at the bottom, but then they also still had regular size screenshots as well. And over to the right, you have the section calling out many of the new features of the game, with some heavy hitters, including being able to have up to 4 players now, which is one of the first things someone upgrading from a previous NHL game is going to be interested in. And there are definitely some substantial additions that I'll get more into in a bit. Opening up the case, and you're about to see why I said this is a true complete in-box release. Personally, when I say I collect all these titles as complete, I'm really only talking about the case, cartridge, and manual, and then maybe a map or hint book if it's an RPG. If there's posters or warranty reply cards, those are nice to have, but I really don't care. With this copy though, you'll notice that not only do I have the manual, but there's also the aforementioned poster and warranty card, and then there's also an ad postcard for the 4-way player adapter, and EA Sports clothes, and I would love to see if any of those clothes actually still exist in 2023. And then what also appears to be an EA Sports POG, if you know what those are. And finally, a sample pack of EA Sports NHL cards, which, believe it or not, definitely does actually exist, and you can find them on eBay for far more than NHL 94 the game costs itself. Oh, and the manual is a traditional solid EA Sports manual that completely covers the game and includes stats for all teams, so you don't have to go look them up in-game, which is nice. Okay, that's the surprisingly well-rounded package. Let's hit the ice and see how NHL 94 compares to previous entries in the series. NHL 94 is the classic game that it is for one simple reason. EA finally figured out that hockey fans, or really any sports fans in general for that matter, didn't just want team names and logos, or real player names. They wanted it all, to truly have the experience of a virtual NHL game that would reflect something that they would either watch on TV, or, even better, attend in person. Now, that statement is pretty reductive. There's tons of great things about NHL 94 that were added besides the dual licensing from both the NHL and NHLPA. But let's be real, it was the big draw to make people buy a new edition of NHL Hockey if they either had never owned one before or previously owned either the original NHL Hockey or NHLPA Hockey 93. Having only licensing from either the Sports League or the Players Association was a common problem in the 8 and 16-bit era, and games that had both were the exception to the rule. For every Tecmo Super Bowl and Tecmo Super NBA Basketball that got it right, there was a Tecmo Super Hockey or Tecmo Super Baseball that only had Players Association licenses and not league licenses. And to be fair to the game publishers, licensing is expensive, especially when you're talking about the 4 major sports organizations, and then doubly so when you have to get a license from both the league and the Players Association. So sometimes it totally made sense that perhaps a publisher just simply couldn't afford to purchase the license, or run into a problem like Electronic Arts had with the original Lakers vs. Celtics, and not realize that the license they purchased didn't extend internationally, causing that game to be pulled before its European release. Oops. However, as nice as it is to finally have both licenses included in the game, just re-releasing NHLPA Hockey 93 with some team logos wasn't exactly going to set the world on fire. And as part of the licensing deal to get the NHL license back, EA had to agree to pull fighting from the game, so technically NHL 94 is missing a feature that the first two games had. Personally, I don't mind that fighting was removed, but there are some people out there that honestly prefer NHLPA Hockey 93 because it still had the fighting included, so I do have to mention it. To make up for that loss, NHL 94 claims to have over 25 features that differentiate itself from NHLPA Hockey 93, and some of those changes are a big deal, and then others are definitely the marketing department stretching the truth a bit. One of the additions to the game, and one that honestly I was kind of surprised hadn't been included before, is the penalty shot. Penalty shots aren't a common occurrence in hockey, but they do happen from time to time, so having them included in the game is very nice, especially since their use isn't limited to some sort of sudden death overtime mode. They will occur during games from time to time, and the mode is executed well, with all of the excitement that normally goes when you have a one-on-one matchup between an offensive player and the goalie. Another addition to the game is something that EA Sports was very bullish on the time, and actually something that would become more and more popular as the 90s and early 2000s moved on, and that was having support for up to 4 players. The previous games in the series were already very fun in multiplayer, so now just think about the ability to have a 3rd or 4th player added to the mix. There is one issue with this mode, and that is something that even affects single player, but keep in mind the screen is only so big, and it simply doesn't show the entire rink, meaning that it's altogether possible for players to end up off screen and either have to try to skate on screen or switch to a closer skater. It's not the end of the world, and well-skilled players will quickly adjust, but it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when and not if. Hopefully though, when it does happen, your players won't be in an offside position, because when I played through the game this past week, I cannot remember how many times I accidentally tripped an offside because I missed the referee's signal, and it really didn't appear that someone was offside for me because I would be headed down the left or right side of the ice, and sure enough, the other winger would be there, but off the screen to the other side. Frustrating, but also an understandable thing just due to the limitations of the technology at the time. Another new feature that at first is a bit of a head-scratcher is battery backup for save games. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, NHLPA Hockey 93 had battery backup. You didn't have to use passwords to continue your game. And you would be 100% correct. However, what NHLPA Hockey 93 did not have was the ability to essentially create player profiles that could be named and chosen when you go to start a game. These profiles allow players to save their win-loss record and also compete for records amongst most goals scored and most saves. It's not a huge deal, but it is notable for EA to start using battery to back up for something other than just purely save games. If you've played either of the first 2 games in the series, you'll know what to expect from a gameplay perspective when it comes to NHL 94, with the game looking and feeling very similar to those previous games, just due to reusing the same engine again. The controls to the game are exactly the same as what came before, with just a few slight tweaks, so veteran players will be able to just pick up a controller and start their quest for the Stanley Cup. However, those players should note 2 important additions that they might want to add to their repertoire: one-timers and goalie control. Of those 2 features, the one that I think that everyone should learn to use and enjoy, and the other one is definitely one that's only for the hardcore, those that really want to control and feel every aspect of the game. If you're not a big hockey fan, one-timers are exactly what they sound like, and come from one of the most exciting parts of the game. In the game, when you're passing from player to player, if you hit the shot button before your player receives the puck, the player will wind up and greet the pass with a shot right at the net. These aren't guaranteed to go in, and you'll definitely want to be paying attention on offense to try to make sure your players are in a good position to try to attempt this. But when these hit, the feeling is as good as seeing it happen in real life, and due to that nature, stats for one-timers are accumulated and displayed amongst all the other stats. Goalie control, however, is something I'm a little bit less excited about. But again, I think that's because I'm simply not a hardcore fan, to appreciate it versus other hockey fans. And like battery backup, you might be confused and thinking, well, wait a minute, I specifically remember controlling my goalie when he had the puck in previous games. And you did, after the goalie got the puck. Now, the game has the option for you to control the goalie without the puck as well, and make your own attempts to get saves. As mentioned, I could see this appealing to the hardcore fans, but if there's one thing I know, it's that I am not as good a goalie as the computer is, and putting me in charge of that is a disaster waiting to happen. Still, a nice thing to include, it's just not for me, and thankfully it's optional. Graphically, you'll have a hard time distinguishing NHL 94 from its forerunners. This isn't to say that the game looks bad, it's just that you've seen it before, and the only differences come in small details. The Genesis version, like most EA Sports games at the time, runs much better and smoother than the Super Nintendo version, so either it or possibly the Sega CD version are clearly the versions to play. Perhaps to try to attempt to add something new to the game graphically, NHL 94 includes digitized pictures of all the starters, and these are shown before games when Ron Barr is shown breaking down the matchups. Of course, with them being black and white and relatively low res, they aren't the best pictures in the world, but at least EA was trying something new here, and I like how they used the pictures to enhance the broadcast feel of the pre-game festivities. The sound in game is largely the same as what came before as well, but at least that sound design came from Rob Hubbard originally, so it was already high quality. In addition to the music and sound effects that were brought over from before, organist Dieter Ruhl, who was currently the organist for both the LA Dodgers and LA Kings, and who was also the San Jose Sharks organist when NHL 94 was produced, was brought on board to provide organ themes for every team in the game. That might seem like a small detail, but having good quality organ music played during a game that is otherwise relatively silent aside from sound effects and crowd noise during gameplay is huge for the mood of the game, and adds to the already great feel of NHL 94, and just makes the game's action that much more immersive. And I really appreciate the fact that EA went out and got an actual pro to record those tracks. There's a lot of people out there that consider NHL 94 to be one of the not just great sports games of all time, but also an all-timer for any genre of game. And to be honest, when I knew I was going to be reviewing it this week, I had in the back of my mind, is this going to be a 4-star game, or am I going to be handing out a 5-star review for the second time this year? But then I played through it this week, running all the way through the playoffs to win the Stanley Cup with my Rangers, and realized that as great as it is, I realize it's not perfect, for one simple reason. There's no season mode. Unfortunately, the only additional gameplay mode added to the game from NHL Hockey 93 is the shootout mode, with your remaining options being either a one-on-one game exhibition or the standard playoff mode carried over from the previous game. And don't get me wrong, those three options are fine, but other sports games had started to break away from only having tournament modes at that time, so NHL 94 not having a season mode definitely feels like a bit of a miss, especially since the game does include stat tracking during your run to the Cup. So it doesn't feel like they'd have to add that much more to add a season mode, even if it wasn't a full 84 games. Due to that omission, I'm awarding NHL 94 4 stars, because as great as the game is, and it is great, don't get me wrong, it just feels like something is missing. Maybe that something can be provided by a future game in the series, but that's a different video.
Okay, and that was NHL 94 for the Genesis. If you think that the game is perfect, if you think it's worth 5 stars, I'm certainly not going to argue with you. It is well deserving of its reputation as one of the best sports games of all time, and there's a reason why those modern ports and re-releases of the game exist. Having already played both Bill Walsh College Football for both the Genesis and the Sega CD, I've seen how EA has tried to enhance their Sega CD offerings from just the cartridge version, and in Bill Walsh, there were definitely some good enhancements, but there was also the digitized video that was about as useful as a screen door in a submarine. So I'm definitely very curious when I come back to NHL 94 on the Sega CD, what my reaction will be to that particular version. I know it's going to be better, but just how much better is the question. Next up on Zilog and Moto, well, it's been a while since we've looked at the Sega CD, so I think we should visit it at least one more time before the end of the season. And in this next episode, let's go all the way back to the beginning of the life on the Sega CD
and review one of 2 games that was only ever released as a pack-in game for the original Sega CD. So if you didn't get a copy of it with your Model 1, you weren't playing it. And as a result, it's somewhat difficult to find complete in 2023. I played it a bit back in the day, and I thought it was interesting, but I never got very far. So I'm excited to spend some time with it next week and dig a bit deeper into the mystery. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 217. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.